Hello, everyone. I wanted to do a review video for the Hans Jonas essay, questions for Hans Jonas's essay, The Burden and Blessing of Mortality. Number one, in what sense does Jonas think that mortality is a burden? In what sense a blessing? The important thing here is to make the prior distinction which he makes between the possibility of death, the so-called can die, and the ultimate inevitability of death, the must die or will die. That is, there's two senses of mortality for Jonas. The fact that a mortal creature is subject to death at any moment, and he distinguishes that from the sense in which a mortal creature is ultimately fated for death. That is, it could happen at any moment. That's the can die. It definitely will happen at some time in the future. That's the will die. Those are the two senses, and it's the first one, the can die, the perpetual possibility of death, that he regards as the burden. It is the ultimate inevitability of death. The fact that, although we may not know when, we know that eventually death will happen. He regards that as the blessing. Number two, how does the ontology of organisms differ from that of other things? That's a big question, big issue in this essay. The ontology of organisms and how it differs from non-organic beings. The ontology of living things, biologically living things, as opposed to other sorts of things, like blocks of wood and planets and moons and molecules and atoms and rocks. Or did I say rocks already? Okay. The ontology of organisms would be the manner of being of organisms. So ontology is the study of being. So something's ontology is its way of being. And the way of being of an organism, he says, is that its being is its own doing. That is, the being of an organism is a certain type of activity. It's not sort of just being composed of a certain type of material and just sort of existing in that sort of inert way. That the ontology of organisms is that they must continue to be active and do and express themselves in their activity in order to be. And he identifies that with metabolism. That he says that's the universal characteristic of organisms is the constant activity that is we call metabolism. And this is such an important question because it really does lead up to the notion of mortality as a burden, because it is the idea that this activity must continue in order for the organism to be, which is obviously very vulnerable. That's the burden of mortality, is that the possibility of an ending to the organism is there at every moment, because there's a possibility of the ending to the activity that is necessary in order for the organism to continue to be. So this leads into question three: in what sense is the being of an organism a task? If we think of an inanimate object, it has a kind of a being, but its being is not a task. It doesn't have to achieve anything to continue to be what it is, whereas the humblest organism has to constantly do that. There's an effort involved. There's a problem to be solved, let's say, at every moment of the existence of an organism, and that is, how are we going to get to the next moment? If you're a diamond or the Earth's moon or a block of wood, there's no task. There's nothing that needs to be done in order to continue to be in the next moment. Those things will exist until some force destroys them. But an organism may stop existing because of just any sort of interruption of any time of the task, of the activity, rather, of the metabolizing necessary in order to continue to be. So, life, or the being, becomes a task, a kind of a labor, a kind of a dramatic effort. So that's really those first two questions are really, or the excuse me, second and third questions are really about the burden. It's only the fourth question that refers to the blessing. Do you agree with Jonas's conclusion that our mortality can be viewed as a blessing? Why or why not? That's obviously an open question, but it does sort of take for granted that you know why he believes that our mortality can be viewed as a blessing. And the first thing is to say, well, he's strictly talking about the second sense, the ultimate inevitability of death, which more or less boils down to us not being immortal, that a human being does not last forever. That is what he regards as the blessing. And remember, a blessing is something good. To be blessed is to be lucky. So he's essentially saying that we're lucky that we're not immortal. We wouldn't want to be immortal. Do you agree with his conclusion? Well, it really depends upon whether you agree with his reasoning. And I'll just refer briefly to his reasons for believing that ultimate mortality, that death as a certainty in the future is a blessing. One has to do with our need for new people to come into our culture and civilization to move it along. Obviously, if people stop dying, there would be a big problem in terms of resources, and we would have to stop producing new people, he says. And this would be a terrible disaster because it would lead to a stagnant civilization. We need natality, people being born, to balance our mortality, people leaving. That he views that as a fundamental balance of communal human life. So on the social level, we need death because without death, we couldn't have new people. But even on the individual level, none of us would want to live forever, he says, because the human mind is finite, is only able to assimilate a certain amount of experience, to have a certain amount of memory. But if we lived for a very, very, very long time, we would either have to forget much of our past in order to assimilate new experience and thereby kind of become a different person, not have that continuity of personhood that presumably we do have in our lives now. Or we would have to stop assimilating new experiences and we would just become stagnant. So he does not believe that even on the individual level, that immortality or even living a very, very long time, longer than we do, would be something that any of us, if we thought the question through, would actually want. So I don't know if that's something that you agree with or not. I think there are definite questions to that, but it's at least a plausible argument.